In the vast expanse of Arizona's high desert, where red rock meets endless sky, there stands a ranch that money built but love forgot. Colton Wade owns more land than most men could walk in a lifetime, yet he lives like a hermit behind walls, of his own making. For 20 years, he's trusted no one, loved nothing, and spoken only when necessary. His wealth shields him from the world, but it also keeps out everything that makes life worth living. Then, one scorching afternoon, a beat-up truck rattles down his mile-long driveway, carrying a young woman with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her heart. Tessa Bloom has nothing to her name except stubbornness and a willingness to work harder than any man on his payroll. She's about to discover that some hearts aren't meant to stay frozen forever. But will the secret she's hiding destroy everything before love gets its chance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hand-carved wooden sign at the entrance to Wade Ranch had weathered 73 Arizona summers, its letters now more shadow than paint against the bleached oak. Wade Ranch Est, 1952, the year Colton's grandfather had claimed this stretch of high desert with nothing but determination and a borrowed stake. 3 generations of Wades had worked this land, but only one had learned to live on it alone. Colton Wade rose each morning at 5:30, not because the ranch demanded it, but because sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford. Dreams had a way of bringing back faces he'd rather forget. Voices that whispered promises as empty as the wind that swept across his 40,000 acres. Better to meet the day on his feet than wrestle with ghosts in his bed. The morning ritual never varied. Black coffee, no sugar, drunk standing at the kitchen window that overlooked the main corral. The newspaper, scanned but rarely read. The outside world had stopped mattering to him, somewhere around the time he'd stopped believing in the goodness of people. Then the walk to the stables, where his boots echoed hollow on the concrete. Floors, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his solitude. His ranch hands knew better than to attempt conversation beyond the necessary exchange of duties. Miguel, his foreman for the past 12 years, understood the unspoken rules better than most. A nod of greeting, a brief rundown of the day's tasks, and then blessed silence. The men respected Colton's need for distance, though whether that respect came from understanding or fear, he'd never bothered to ask. The Wade Ranch stretched across some of the most beautiful land in Arizona, where red sandstone mesas rose like ancient cathedrals against an endless sky. Colton owned mineral rights, water rights, and grazing permits that made him one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. Yet wealth, he'd learned, was a poor substitute for warmth. Money could buy isolation, but it couldn't purchase peace. His grandfather's study remained exactly as it had been when the old man died 15 years ago. Books lined the walls, volumes on cattle breeding, range management, and Arizona history that represented 3 generations of accumulated wisdom. But wisdom, Colton had discovered, was different from understanding. He understood business, land management, and profit margins. What he'd never understood was how his grandfather had managed to build an empire while keeping his heart intact. The betrayal had come 20 years ago, though Colton tried not to measure his life in before and after anymore. Sarah Bloom had been everything he'd thought he wanted. Beautiful, charming, and seemingly devoted to the quiet rancher who'd offered her his heart and his name. She'd accepted both, then disappeared 3 days before their wedding with $50,000 from his account and his business partner, taking with her every ounce of trust he'd possessed. The townspeople of Clearwater knew the story, or thought they did. Some pitied him. Others whispered that he'd gotten what he deserved for being fool enough to trust a woman half his age. Most had simply moved on, as people do, leaving Colton to navigate the aftermath alone. He'd built walls, not just around his property, but around his heart, and had spent 2 decades making sure they were high enough to keep everyone out. The kitchen where he took his solitary meals had been designed by Sarah, back when they'd planned, to fill the house with children and laughter. Now it remained a monument to hopes that had died before they'd had a chance to flourish. The long dining table sat empty every evening, set for one out of habit rather than need. He'd considered selling the ranch more than once, starting over somewhere his past couldn't follow him, but the land was in his blood. Leaving would mean admitting defeat, and Wade men didn't surrender. At 61, Colton had settled into a rhythm that might charitably be called living. He managed his business with the efficiency of a man who understood that success required no emotional investment. His lawyers handled contracts, his accountants managed finances, and his foreman oversaw daily operations. Colton himself had become something of a ghost on his own property, present, but not participating in the life that surrounded him. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he'd become exactly what Sarah had accused him of being, a man married to his land instead of his heart. The difference was that now he wore that isolation like armor, protection against a world that had taught him too well that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Evening found him where morning had begun, standing at the kitchen window with a glass of whiskey instead of coffee, watching the sun set behind the mesas that had witnessed 3 generations of Wade dreams and disappointments. Tomorrow would bring another day identical to today, and the day after that, and all the days that stretched ahead like an endless horizon of careful solitude. He'd grown comfortable with emptiness, or so he told himself. Comfortable enough that when the sound of an unfamiliar engine broke the evening quiet, he felt the first stirring of something he'd thought long dead, curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. The battered leather journal had seen better. Decades. Its cover, once a rich brown, had faded to the color of desert sand, and its pages held the dreams of a young woman who'd learned early that hope was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender. Tessa Bloom clutched it against her chest as her ancient pickup truck wheezed up the mile-long driveway to Wade Ranch, each pothole jarring loose, another prayer that this time would be different. The truck's engine had been making concerning noises for the past 50 miles, and the temperature gauge hovered dangerously close to the red zone. She'd coaxed it this far on willpower and the last $23 in her pocket, but even faith had its limits. When the imposing ranch house finally came into view, nestled against red rock cliffs like something from a Western painting, Tessa whispered a quiet thank you to whatever guardian angels might be listening. She'd heard about Colton Wade from the gossips at the diner in Phoenix, the rich hermit who owned half the county but trusted no one. They'd called him everything from eccentric to downright mean, but they'd also mentioned he paid fair wages to anyone willing to work hard. Tessa had been willing to work hard her entire life. It was trusting that had gotten her into trouble. Truck's final death rattle coincided with her arrival at the main house, steam rising from under the hood like incense at a funeral. Tessa sat for a moment, gathering courage and checking her reflection in the cracked rearview mirror. Dust from 3 states clung to her dark hair, and her clothes bore the evidence of too many days on the road, but her green eyes still held the determination that had carried her this far. The front door opened before she'd even knocked, revealing a man who seemed carved from the same weathered stone as the landscape around him. Colton Wade was taller than she'd expected, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years squinting into the desert sun. Those eyes, a pale blue that reminded her of winter skies, regarded her with the wariness of a man who'd learned to expect disappointment from unexpected visitors. "You lost?" His voice carried the weight of authority and the weariness of someone who'd heard too many sob stories from strangers looking for handouts. "No, sir. I'm exactly where I need to be." Tessa straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of confidence she wasn't sure she possessed. "I'm looking for work. I can clean, cook, mend fences, tend horses, whatever needs doing." Colton's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested amusement wasn't entirely dead in him. "I didn't advertise for help." "I know. but I figure a place this size always has work for someone willing to do it right." She gestured toward the vast expanse of ranch land visible from where they stood. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Wade. I'm asking for a chance to earn my keep. You know my name. People talk, especially about successful men who prefer their privacy." She met his gaze steadily, neither challenging nor submissive. "They also talk about men who pay honest wages for honest work." Something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or recognition of the subtle flattery. "And what makes you think you can do honest work? You look like you haven't had a square meal in a week." The assessment stung because it was accurate, but Tessa had learned that showing weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Hungry people work harder than comfortable ones, and I've been hungry long enough to know the value of a good job. "Where you from?" The question came after a long pause, during which she could practically feel him weighing her worth against the trouble she might represent. "Most recently New Mexico. Before that Texas. Before that—" She shrugged, letting the gesture speak for the rootlessness that had defined her life since leaving home. "I go where the work is." "Got references?" "I've got hands that work, and a back that's stronger than it looks." She held up her palms, calloused from years of hard labor. "Sometimes that has to be reference enough." Colton studied her for what felt like an eternity, his pale eyes searching for something she couldn't name. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the ancient cottonwoods that shaded the house. Somewhere in the distance, a horse nickered, and the sound seemed to make up his mind. "1 week," he said finally. "Trial basis. You can sleep in the bunkhouse, eat with the hands. If you can keep up and keep your mouth shut, we'll talk about something permanent." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you, Mr. Wade. You won't regret this." "I regret most decisions involving strangers," he replied, but there was no real harshness in it. "Miguel will show you around. Work starts at sunrise." As he turned to go back inside, Tessa clutched her journal tighter and whispered another prayer, this time of gratitude. She'd found sanctuary, however temporary, and maybe, if she was careful and lucky, she might find something more. What she couldn't know was that the man walking away from her was about to discover that some visitors bring more than just the promise of honest work. The chipped ceramic coffee mug had seen better decades, its once bright wildflower pattern now faded to gentle whispers of yellow and blue. It was the only personal possession Tessa had carried with her through 3 states and countless temporary jobs, a reminder of the grandmother who taught her that beauty could be found in the simplest things. As she sipped her first cup of ranch coffee at 4:30 in the morning, the familiar weight of the mug in her hands steadied her nerves for the day ahead. Miguel Hernandez had been foreman of Wade Ranch for 12 years, and in that time, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his boss's mood. This morning, those signs suggested curiosity warring with caution, never a good combination when it came to Colton Wade's decision-making. The appearance of the young woman had clearly unsettled the careful routine that governed ranch life, though whether that unsettling would prove beneficial remained to be seen. "You sure you know what you signed up for?" Miguel asked as he led Tessa toward the horse barn. His English carried the musical cadence of his native Mexico, softened by years in Arizona but never entirely lost. "Mr. Wade, he don't usually take on help without checking references, running background checks, the whole 9 yards. Maybe he saw something in me worth taking a chance on," Tessa replied, though she kept her voice light to hide the uncertainty beneath. The truth was, she needed this job more than she could afford to admit, and not just for the money. The morning air carried the scent of hay and leather, horse sweat, and the distant promise of desert rain. Tessa breathed deeply, letting the familiar smells ease the knot of anxiety in her chest. She'd worked ranches before, knew the rhythm of this life, even if she'd never been allowed to stay long enough to truly belong to it. The horses regarded her with the frank curiosity of creatures who understood that judgment should be reserved until character was proven. Tessa approached the first stall slowly, murmuring soft words to the bay gelding, who watched her with intelligent dark eyes. "That's Thunder," Miguel said. "Mr. Wade's favorite, though he'd never admit to having favorites." "Hello, Thunder," Tessa whispered, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. "You're a handsome fellow, aren't you? I bet you've got stories to tell." The gelding's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice, and after a moment's consideration, he allowed her to stroke his neck. It was a small victory, but Tessa had learned to appreciate small victories. They often led to larger ones. "You got away with them," Miguel observed, genuine approval in his voice. "That's good. Horses, they know if you're honest or not." Tessa spent the morning learning the layout of the ranch, the names and temperaments of the animals, and the endless list of tasks that kept a spread this size running smoothly. She mucked stalls without complaint, hauled feed with determination that impressed the other hands, and approached each job with the quiet competence of someone who understood that work was a form of prayer. Colton made his appearance just after 10, his pale eyes scanning the barn with the practiced efficiency of a man who noticed everything. His gaze lingered on Tessa for a moment as she brushed down a mare, noting the gentle way she worked and the soft words she murmured to calm the animal. "She's a natural," Miguel reported when Colton approached. "Hasn't complained once, and the horses like her?" Colton nodded, but said nothing. Tessa pretended not to notice his scrutiny, though she felt the weight of his attention like sunlight on her shoulders. There was something in his gaze that made her want to prove herself worthy of whatever faith had prompted him to give her this chance. The afternoon brought fence repairs, and Tessa surprised everyone by producing a worn pair of work gloves and a small toolkit from her truck. She worked alongside the men without trying to prove anything, simply doing what needed to be done with the steady persistence of someone who understood that ranch work was about endurance rather than speed. "Where'd you learn to handle wire like that?" asked Jake, one of the younger hands, as Tessa deftly spliced a break in the fencing. "My grandfather," she answered, not elaborating. Some stories were too complicated for a first day, too heavy with the weight of memory and loss. As the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, Tessa found herself humming while she worked, an old song her grandmother had sung while tending her own small garden. She didn't realize she was doing it until she noticed the silence that had fallen around her, the way the other workers had paused to listen to the melody that seemed to bring something alive in the desert air. From his position near the barn, Colton heard it too. The sound stirred something he'd thought long dormant, a recognition that music had once been part of his life before silence became his preferred companion. He turned away before anyone could see the expression on his face, but not before Miguel caught the slight softening around his eyes that suggested the first small crack in 20 years of carefully maintained walls. The old transistor radio had been gathering dust in the bunkhouse for years, forgotten by whoever had left it behind. Tessa discovered it while organizing her few belongings on her second morning. Its silver antenna bent and its plastic casing cracked, but its spirit apparently intact. When she managed to coax it to life, the tinny sound of classic country music filled the previously silent kitchen where she'd volunteered to prepare breakfast for the crew. "Haven't heard that thing work in 5 years, Miguel said, pausing in the doorway as Hank Williams crooned about being so lonesome he could cry. "Used to belong to Tommy, one of the hands who worked here before you came." "Well, it just needed someone to believe in it," Tessa replied, stirring eggs in a cast-iron skillet that had probably fed cowboys since before she was born. "Sometimes things just need a little attention to remember what they're meant to do." Churchuchil kitchen had been designed for functionality rather than warmth. All stainless steel surfaces and commercial-grade appliances that could feed a crew efficiently, but held no memory of family meals or shared laughter. Yet somehow, Tessa's presence began to transform the space. She'd found wildflowers growing near the creek and arranged them in a mason jar on the central table. The radio provided a soundtrack that made even mundane tasks feel less like work. and more like life. By the time the hands gathered for breakfast, the sterile kitchen had become something approaching welcoming. The men filed in quietly, unsure how to respond to the change. They'd grown accustomed to grabbing quick meals in silence, eating standing up or taking their plates back to the bunkhouse. But Tessa had set the table properly, with mismatched plates that she'd found in various cabinets and cloth napkins that had never seen use. "Sit," she commanded gently when they hesitated. "Food tastes better when you're not rushed." Jake, the youngest of the crew, was the first to settle into a chair. "Smells like my grandmother's kitchen," he said with wonder, as if he'd forgotten that food could be about more than mere sustenance. "That's the highest compliment you could give me," Tessa replied, serving fluffy scrambled eggs alongside bacon that she'd somehow managed to cook to perfection despite the industrial-sized griddle. "Grandmothers know the secret ingredient that makes everything better." "What's that?" asked Carlos, another hand who'd been working the ranch for nearly a decade. "Love," Tessa said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Food made with love always tastes different." The men exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to such open sentiment in a place where emotions had been carefully buried for years. But as they ate, conversation began to flow more freely than it had in recent memory. Jake talked about his plans to save money for veterinary school. Carlos mentioned his daughter's upcoming quinceañera. Even Silent Pete, who'd earned his nickname, through years of careful word conservation, managed a few sentences about the weather patterns he'd been observing. Colton's appearance in the doorway brought a momentary hush to the proceedings. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the scene of his employees actually enjoying their meal, instead of wolfing it down before hurrying back to work. His gaze settled on Tessa, who was refilling coffee cups and chatting easily with men who'd barely spoken to each other beyond work-related necessity. "Morning, Mr. Wade," she said, without any of the deference the others showed him. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." "I don't usually," he began, then stopped himself. The truth was, he hadn't eaten breakfast with other people in 20 years, preferring the isolation of his own kitchen to the potential complications of shared meals. "One cup won't hurt," Miguel said quietly, speaking the words that everyone was thinking but no one else dared voice. Tessa had already poured the coffee, black as he preferred it, and gestured toward an empty chair at the head of the table. The chair where his grandfather used to sit during family meals, back when the kitchen had been filled with voices and laughter instead of efficient silence. He found himself sitting down before he'd consciously made the decision, accepting the plate. Tessa placed before him with eggs that were perfectly fluffy and bacon that was crispy but not burnt. The radio played softly in the background, some old Patsy Cline song about falling to pieces, and for a moment Colton felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for so long. "These are good," he said finally, surprised by his own voice in the domestic scene. "Thank you," Tessa replied, and her smile was so genuine that it reminded him of mornings long ago when breakfast had been about more than fuel for the day ahead. Later, as he walked toward his office, Colton found himself humming the melody that had been playing on the radio. He stopped abruptly when he realized what he was doing, disturbed by this evidence of how quickly one person could begin to alter the careful patterns of his life. But that evening, as he stood at his kitchen window watching the sunset, he discovered himself listening for the sound of laughter from the bunkhouse, where his employees were apparently learning to enjoy their meals again. Change, he reflected, had a way of sneaking up on a man when he wasn't paying proper attention. The dusty photo album had been buried in the bottom drawer of Colton's grandfather's desk for 15 years, hidden beneath financial records and ranch documents like a secret too painful to acknowledge. Its leather cover bore the scars of handling by generations of Wades, and its pages held images of a family that had once believed in permanence, in the possibility that love could outlast the harsh realities of desert life. Tessa discovered it by accident while helping Colton organize paperwork for the quarterly tax filing. She'd been reaching for a folder of receipts when her fingers brushed against the album's worn edge, and curiosity had gotten the better of discretion. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, when Colton looked up from his ledger to find her holding the album. "I didn't mean to pry, I was just looking for the equipment receipts and—" "It's fine," he said, though his voice carried a tension that suggested otherwise. "Just old family pictures, nothing important." But Tessa had already glimpsed the photograph on the first page, a young man who looked remarkably like Colton, standing beside a beautiful woman in a wedding dress, both of them radiating the kind of happiness that seemed to light the world around them. The resemblance was unmistakable, but it was the joy in the young man's eyes that struck her most powerfully. This was Colton, before whatever had happened to hollow out his heart. "Your grandparents?" she asked softly, settling the album on the desk between them. "Wedding day 1952. His fingers traced the edge of the photograph without quite touching it. "Same year they founded the ranch. Grandpa used to say they built everything together, the house, the business, the family. Said partnership was the secret to lasting success. They look happy." It was an inadequate observation, but Tessa found herself moved by the obvious devotion captured in the black and white image. They were married 47 years before cancer took her. Grandpa never remarried, said he'd had his great love, and wouldn't settle for anything less. Colton's voice carried a mixture of admiration and something that might have been regret. Without asking permission, Tessa turned the page, revealing more photographs. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family gatherings where multiple generations smiled at the camera with the easy confidence of people who belonged to each other. There was young Colton at various ages, a boy who'd apparently known how to laugh before life taught him to guard his emotions. "You looked happy too," she observed, studying a picture of 10-year-old Colton sitting on a horse nearly twice his size, grinning with the fearless joy of childhood. "I was. This place was different then, full of people, full of noise. Grandpa and Grandma hosted every holiday, every celebration. The kitchen table barely held everyone during Sunday dinners." He paused, lost in memory. "I thought that's what my life would look like. Big family, lots of grandkids running around, continuing the tradition. What changed?" The question slipped out before Tessa could stop herself, but Colton didn't seem to mind the intrusion. "I trusted the wrong person. Made plans with someone who didn't share my vision of the future." His jaw tightened slightly, but he continued, turning pages in the album. "Learned that some people see opportunity where others see partnership." They sat in comfortable silence, looking through years of documented happiness, rodeos and roundups, birthday celebrations and quiet moments that spoke of a family that had understood how to love each other well. Tessa found herself studying Colton's face as much as the photographs, watching the play of emotions as he revisited a past that clearly still held power over him. "You could still have that," she said finally, the words emerging before wisdom. "Who could intervene? The family, the celebrations, the life your grandparents built. It's not too late, isn't it?" His pale eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw past the carefully maintained walls to the loneliness that lived beneath. "I'm 61. Years old, Tessa, set in my ways, used to silence. What woman would want to take on a project like me?" "The right woman wouldn't see you as a project," she replied, holding his gaze despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. "She'd see you as a man worth knowing, worth loving." Something shifted in the space between them, a recognition that their conversation had moved beyond employer and employee into territory neither had intended to explore. Colton closed the album carefully, as if shutting away not just the photographs, but the possibility of hope they represented. "Sometimes knowing someone comes with too high a price," he said quietly, "for both people involved." But as Tessa returned to her filing and Colton went back to his ledgers, both were acutely aware that something had changed in the afternoon light filtering through the office windows. The album sat between them like a bridge across 20 years of careful isolation, its pages holding proof that love was possible even in the harsh beauty of the desert, if a person was brave enough to risk his heart one more time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a postal service truck that rarely had reason to venture down the Wade Ranch driveway. Tessa's name was written across the envelope in handwriting she recognized with a sinking heart, and the return address confirmed her worst fears. She slipped it into her jacket pocket before anyone could notice, but the weight of it seemed to impress against her ribs like a physical reminder of the past she'd been trying so hard to escape. For 3 weeks, she'd allowed herself to believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe she could stay long enough to put down roots, to become part of something larger than her own survival. The work at Wade Ranch had given her purpose, and the growing warmth in Colton's eyes when he looked at her had kindled hopes she'd thought long dead. But the letter in her pocket served as a harsh reminder that some mistakes followed you, no matter how far you ran. She managed to maintain her composure through morning chores, feeding the horses and mucking stalls with the same care she'd shown since her arrival. But Miguel noticed the change in her demeanor immediately, the way her usual humming had stopped, how her shoulders carried a tension that hadn't been there the day before. "You okay, Mija?" he asked during the lunch break, using the affectionate term that had become natural over the weeks of working together. "Just tired," she replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Didn't sleep well last night." It wasn't entirely a lie. Sleep had become elusive lately, not because of discomfort, but because of the growing awareness that she was falling in love with a man who'd already been betrayed once by someone he'd trusted. The guilt of her deception had been gnawing at her conscience for days, and now the letter made it impossible to ignore. That evening, after the other hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Tessa found herself alone in the kitchen with the sealed envelope spread before her on the scarred wooden table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, though she already knew what it would contain. The words were brief but devastating in their implications. "Tessa, found you. We need to talk. Your debt to the family isn't forgotten. Neither is your father's betrayal. Call me Marcus." The letter was signed with a phone number and an address in Phoenix that made her stomach clench with remembered fear. Marcus Hendricks had been her father's business partner 20 years ago, back when Daniel Bloom had thought he could get rich quick by embezzling from investors and disappearing into the night. What Marcus had never known, what no one had known except Tessa, was that her father had hidden the stolen money and died without revealing its location. Footsteps on the porch interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and she quickly folded the letter back into its envelope, shoving it into her pocket just as Colton appeared in the doorway. He'd taken to stopping by the kitchen in the evenings, drawn by the warmth and companionship that had become natural between them over shared cups of coffee and quiet conversation. "Thought I might find you here," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the easy familiarity that had developed over the past week. "You seem distracted today. Everything all right?" The concern in his voice made her chest tighten with guilt. How could she tell him that everything he was beginning to trust in her was built on deception, that she was the daughter of the man who'd betrayed him 20 years ago, and that the past was once again reaching out to destroy any chance of happiness he might find? "Just thinking about the future," she said carefully, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Sometimes it's hard to know what comes next." "I used to think the future was something you could plan," Colton replied, studying her, faced with the attention that had become both comforting and terrifying. "Map it out like a business strategy, control all the variables. But lately, I'm learning that maybe the best things come when you stop trying to control everything." His words were a knife to her heart. He was opening himself to possibility again, learning to trust despite 20 years of careful isolation. And she was sitting across from him, harboring the very kind of secret that had taught him to guard his heart in the first place. "Colton," she began. then stopped, unable to find words that would prepare him for the truth without destroying the fragile bond they'd built. "What is it?" His hand moved across the table to cover hers, the first deliberate physical contact between them, and the warmth of his touch made her want to weep for what she was about to lose. "Nothing," she whispered, hating herself for the cowardice, but unable to bear the thought of seeing trust die in his eyes. "Just grateful for the chance you gave me here." He squeezed her hand gently, and she memorized the feeling because she suspected it might be the last moment of tenderness she would ever receive from him. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to run again or stay and fight for something that might already be doomed by the sins of her father's past. The wild desert rose had managed to bloom, despite the harsh conditions, its delicate pink petals a defiant splash of color against the red sandstone where Tessa had discovered it during her morning ride. She'd pressed it carefully between them, pages of her journal that evening, drawn to its stubborn beauty and the way it had found life in an unlikely place. Like hope, she thought, it seemed to flourish best when circumstances suggested it had no business surviving at all. The storm had been building all day, dark clouds gathering over the mesas like bruises against the desert sky. By afternoon, the air crackled with electricity and the horses grew restless in their stalls, sensing the approaching tempest with the ancient wisdom of creatures who understood the desert's moods better than the humans who claimed to own it. Colton found Tessa in the equipment barn, securing tools and supplies against the wind that had begun to howl through the canyon walls. She moved with efficient grace, her dark hair whipping around her face as she wrestled a tarp over the hay bales, and something about her determination in the face of the storm stirred emotions he'd been trying to keep carefully contained. "Storm's going to be a big one," he said, raising his voice over the wind. "Weather service is calling for flash flood warnings. You should head back to the bunkhouse before it gets worse." "Almost finished," she called back, securing the last corner of the tarp with hands that had grown strong and capable over her weeks at the ranch. "Just want to make sure everything's protected." A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the barn, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the earth beneath their feet. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm, carrying the scent of sage and creosote that meant the desert was about to come alive with the brief abundance that followed every storm. "Too late now," Colton said as the drops became a downpour, drumming against the metal roof with increasing intensity. "We'll have to wait it out here." They found themselves stranded together in the sudden intimacy of shared shelter. The storm raging outside while they stood in the golden light filtering through rain-streaked windows. The barn smelled of leather and hay, motor oil and the ozone that preceded lightning, and somehow the combination created an atmosphere that seemed to strip away the careful distance they'd both been maintaining. "I love desert storms," Tessa said, moving to the window to watch the lightning dance across the sky. "There's something honest about them. No pretense, no holding back, just pure power expressing itself without apology." Colton joined her at the window, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wildflowers in her hair, close enough to notice the way her green eyes reflected the lightning like captured fire. "Most people find them frightening, I guess." "I'm not most people." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "I've learned that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the storms we can't control." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Colton found himself studying the curve of her mouth, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak words that would change everything between them. "Tessa," he said, her name carrying weight of longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel. "In 20 years, I know," she whispered, and somehow those two words contained an acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them. The attraction, the emotional connection, the sense that they were standing on the precipice of something that could either heal them both or destroy what little safety they'd managed to build. When he kissed her, It was with the desperate tenderness of a man who'd forgotten how to hope, reaching towards something that might save him. Her response was immediate and fierce, her hands tangling in his hair as 20 years of loneliness met weeks of growing trust in a moment that felt like coming home. The storm raged around them, but inside the shelter they'd found in each other's arms there was only warmth and the wild beating of hearts that had learned to protect themselves but were choosing vulnerability instead. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the silence between them was profound. "We should talk about this," Colton said, though his hands remained on her face as if he couldn't bear to let her go. "Later," Tessa replied, pulling him close again, because she knew that later would bring complications and difficult truths that might destroy this perfect moment. "Right now, just let us have this." Outside, the storm began to ease, but inside the barn, something had shifted permanently. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, opened their hearts to possibilities that were as beautiful and dangerous as the desert rose that bloomed against all odds in the harshest places. The small velvet jewelry box had been hidden in the back of Colton's bedroom closet for 15 years, tucked behind winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations like a relic from a different life. His mother's wedding ring lay nestled inside, a simple band of white gold set with a modest diamond that had somehow managed to capture and hold the light of 60 years of devoted marriage. He'd kept it safe through 2 decades of bitter solitude, telling himself it was merely family heritage, but now he understood it had been waiting for a woman worthy of its legacy. The morning after the storm found them both moving through their routines with a new awareness of each other that changed. Everything while changing nothing at all. Tessa still prepared breakfast for the crew, still hummed while she worked, but now Colton found himself timing his morning coffee to coincide with her presence in the kitchen, the casual brush of their hands as he passed her the sugar, the way her smile seemed to linger when their eyes met across the table. These small intimacies carried the weight of the promises they'd made to each other in the storm's embrace. "You're different," Miguel observed, as he watched his boss actually participate in the morning conversation instead of drinking his coffee in watchful silence. "Lighter somehow, like you've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down." Colton couldn't deny the accuracy of the observation. The crushing weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion for 20 years had lifted, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize: contentment mixed with anticipation for what each day might bring. Tessa's laughter from across the kitchen seemed to illuminate corners of his heart that had been dark for far too long. Their relationship deepened gradually over the following weeks, built on shared moments stolen between the demands of ranch life. Evening walks along the creek where cottonwoods rustled secrets in the desert breeze. Quiet conversations on the front porch as the sun painted the mesas in shades of gold and crimson. Simple touches that spoke of growing trust. Her hand on his shoulder as she refilled his coffee cup, his fingers brushing hers as they worked side by side repairing tack in the barn. Tessa found herself marveling at the man emerging from behind. The walls Colton had built around his heart. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced when he felt safe, a gentleness with the animals that spoke of deep empathy carefully hidden, and a way of listening that made her feel heard in ways she'd never experienced before. When he told her stories of his grandfather's time building the ranch, his face would soften with memory, and she could see glimpses of the young man who'd once believed in forever. Grandpa used to say that the land chose its people, not the other way around, Colton said one evening as they sat watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. He claimed he knew the moment he saw this place that it was where he belonged, where he was meant to build something lasting. "Do you believe that?" Tessa asked, curled against his side on the porch swing his grandfather had built for his grandmother 60 years ago. "I'm starting to," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Maybe the land was just waiting for the right time to show me what I was supposed to be building here." The weight of her deception pressed against Tessa's conscience like a physical ache. Every tender moment, every shared confidence, every step deeper into love made the truth harder to bear. She knew she should tell him about her father, about the letter from Marcus, about the real reason she'd come to Wade Ranch. But the fear of losing this precious connection, of watching love die in his eyes the way it had 20 years ago, kept the words trapped in her throat. Instead, she allowed herself to fall deeper into the fantasy that love might be enough to overcome the sins of the past. She memorized the way he laughed at her stories, the reverent way he touched her face when he thought she was sleeping, the plans he'd begun to make that included her presence in his future. When he showed her the ring one evening, explaining its history and what it meant to his family, she had to excuse herself to the bathroom to hide her tears. "I want you to know that what we have isn't casual for me," he said when she returned. The ring box sitting open between them on the kitchen table like a promise waiting to be made. "I know it's too soon to make any permanent declarations, but I need you to understand that you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "Hope," he said simply. "For the first time in 20 years, I can imagine a future that includes happiness, includes love, includes the kind of life my grandparents built together." That night, Tessa lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small room in the bunkhouse, her journal open beside her with the pressed desert rose, marking a page of dreams she'd written but might never see fulfilled. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to tell him the truth and risk destroying everything, or continue living the lie that was slowly poisoning the love she'd never thought she deserved. The newspaper clipping arrived in Colton's mailbox. On a Thursday, cut from the Clearwater County Herald's weekly gossip column with surgical precision. Someone had highlighted the relevant passage in yellow marker, ensuring he wouldn't miss the speculation about our most eligible bachelor rancher and his mysterious new employee who seems to have captured more than just his attention. The anonymous sender had thoughtfully included a handwritten note. "Thought you should know what people are saying. A friend." Colton crumpled the clipping without finishing it, but the damage was already done. 20 years of careful privacy had conditioned him to value anonymity above almost everything else, and the idea that his personal life was becoming fodder for public consumption stirred the old defensive instincts that had protected him for so long. Tessa found him standing in his office that evening, staring out the window toward the town, lights in the distance, with an expression she'd learned to recognize as his way of processing difficult emotions. The crumpled newspaper clipping lay on his desk like evidence of some crime neither of them had committed. "Bad news?" she asked softly, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Small-town gossip," he replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd hoped to avoid this particular complication. "Apparently, we've become the local entertainment." She smoothed out the clipping and read the highlighted passage, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at the speculation about her. Motives and background. The columnist had been particularly creative in wondering whether the gold-digging type has finally found her mark, and if poor Colton Wade will fall for the same tricks that fooled him 20 years ago. "I'm sorry," she said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Their relationship, the gossip, or the painful parallels the article drew to his past betrayal. "It's not your fault. This is what happens when people have too much time and too little actual news to discuss." But his jaw was tight with tension, and she could see the walls beginning to rebuild themselves behind his eyes. The gossip followed them everywhere over the next week. At the feed store, conversations stopped when Colton entered, replaced by meaningful looks and whispered speculation. At the diner, where Tessa occasionally picked up supplies, the waitress asked pointed questions about her plans and whether she was settling down permanent-like, with barely concealed suspicion. Some of the attention was kind. Mrs. Henderson from the Church Ladies' Auxiliary made a point of telling Tessa how nice it was to see Colton smiling again, and Doc Martinez mentioned that love was good medicine for any man, especially one who'd been alone too long. But the negative voices seemed louder, more persistent, carrying the weight of a community that had watched one of their own get hurt badly and weren't eager to see it happen again. "People are protective of you," Tessa observed one evening as they sat on the porch, the distance between them on the swing slightly larger than it had been the week before. "Or they enjoy drama," Colton replied, though there was something defeated in his voice that suggested the gossip was affecting him more than he wanted to admit. The pressure intensified when Robert Caldwell, Colton's oldest friend and the bank president who'd helped him rebuild after Sarah's betrayal, stopped by for what he called a friendly visit, but felt more like an intervention. "I'm not telling you how to live your life," Robert said, accepting a cup of coffee in the same kitchen where Tessa had been serving breakfast to the ranch hands just that morning. "But people are talking, and some of what they're saying might be worth considering. Such as how little anyone knows about her background, where she came from, why she showed up here with nothing but the clothes on her back, whether her interest in you has more to do with your bank account than your heart." Robert's words carried the careful tone of a friend delivering unwelcome truth. Colton found himself studying Tessa differently over the following days, noticing things that hadn't seemed significant before. The way she avoided questions about her past, the careful vagueness when anyone asked about her family or previous jobs, the fact that she'd arrived with virtually nothing and had never mentioned friends or relatives who might miss her. The doubt crept in slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. Not because he believed the worst about her intentions, but because the constant speculation from others began to highlight how much about Tessa remained unknown. He'd fallen in love with her warmth, her work ethic, her ability to bring life back to his carefully ordered world. But love built on mystery, he was learning, was vulnerable to the kind of questions that small towns specialized in asking. "Maybe we should slow down," he said one evening, the words emerging before he'd fully decided to speak them. "Give people time to get used to the idea of us before we make any permanent decisions." The hurt that flashed across Tessa's face was immediately replaced by understanding, but the damage was done. The outside world had successfully planted seeds of doubt in the garden they'd been cultivating together, and both of them wondered if love would be strong enough to survive the harsh light of public scrutiny. The hand-whittled wooden horse was no larger than Tessa's palm, its surface smooth from hours of careful carving and sanding. Colton had worked on it in the evenings after she'd gone to bed, his grandfather's old pocket knife moving with surprising delicacy across the piece of cottonwood he'd selected from the grove by the creek. It was the first creative thing he'd made in 20 years, born from an urge to give her something that came from his hands rather than his wallet, something that carried meaning deeper than mere expense. "It's beautiful," Tessa whispered, turning the tiny horse over in her hands to admire the detail he'd managed to capture in such a small piece of wood. The mane flowed with lifelike movement, the legs were positioned in a perfect gallop, and the expression on the carved face somehow conveyed both wildness and grace. "It's thunder," Colton said, though she'd already recognized the likeness to his favorite gelding. "Figured you should have something to remember your first horse friend when—" He stopped, not wanting to voice the possibility that their time together might be temporary. They were sitting on a blanket beside the creek, sharing a picnic lunch that had become their Sunday tradition over the past month. The gossip in town had died down to occasional whispers, and they'd found ways to create privacy within the vast expanse of his ranch, where curious eyes couldn't intrude on the quiet happiness they'd built together. "When what?" she prompted gently, setting the carved horse carefully in her lap. "When you decide whether this life is really what you want," he said, his honesty cutting through the perfect afternoon like a knife. "I know I'm not easy to love, Tessa. Set in my ways, used to being alone. Most women would find that suffocating. After a while, most women aren't me," she replied, reaching for his hand with a confidence that surprised them both. "And maybe being alone isn't the same as being lonely. Maybe you've just been waiting for the right person to share the solitude with." The weeks that followed were the closest thing to perfect that either of them had ever experienced. Tessa continued to transform the ranch house from a fortress of isolation into something that felt like home. She'd planted herbs in the kitchen garden, hung cheerful curtains in the windows, and somehow convinced the old grandfather clock in the hallway to keep proper time again. Colton found himself looking forward to each day with an anticipation he'd forgotten was possible. Their evenings were spent in comfortable companionship. She would read while he worked on ranch paperwork, or they'd sit together on the porch swing, watching the desert come alive with the soft sounds of night. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, dreams for the future, and the quiet observations that lovers exchange when time feels limitless. "I've been thinking about Christmas," Colton said one evening as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "It's been just another day for me for 20 years, but maybe this year we could do something different." "Different how?" Tessa asked, though the warmth in her voice suggested she already approved of whatever he might suggest. "Tree in the living room. Maybe invite Miguel and his family for dinner. Make it feel like a celebration instead of just another Tuesday in December." The words came easier than he'd expected, as if planning for joy was a skill that simply needed practice. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." It was during these perfect weeks that Colton began to seriously consider marriage, not the desperate grab for companionship that had characterized his relationship with Sarah, but the deep certainty that came from truly knowing another person and choosing to build a life together. He found himself studying engagement rings in catalogues that arrived with the ranch supply orders, imagining how his grandmother's wedding band would look on Tessa's finger, planning a proposal that would honor both their histories and their hopes. The irony wasn't lost on him that happiness, when it finally arrived, felt both miraculous and inevitable. Every morning he woke grateful for her presence in his life. Every evening he went to bed amazed that someone could love him despite his flaws and history. The ranch itself seemed to approve of her presence. The horses were calmer, the men worked with more enthusiasm, and even the desert seemed more beautiful when viewed through her appreciative eyes. "I love you," he told her one morning, as she stood at the kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the mesas in shades of gold and rose. The words came naturally, without the careful calculation that had characterized his previous attempts at emotional intimacy. "I love you too," she replied, turning in his arms with a smile that made him believe in forever again. It was the calm before the storm, though neither of them knew it yet. In just a few days, the past would come calling with demands that would test everything they'd built together. But for now, there was only this, the perfect piece of two people who'd found each other against all odds and dared to believe that love might be enough to overcome anything the world could throw at them. The legal documents were spread across the kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene, each page bearing the letterhead of Hendricks and Associates, private investigators, Phoenix, Arizona. Marcus Hendricks had done his homework thoroughly, documenting not just Tessa's current location, but her complete history. Her real name, her father's crimes, her connection to the woman who had betrayed Colton Wade 20 years ago. The file was comprehensive, damning, and unfortunately for Tessa, completely accurate. Robert Caldwell stood in the doorway of the kitchen, where Tessa had served countless breakfasts to the ranch hands, where she and Colton had shared quiet morning conversations and tentative dreams of the future. His expression carried the grim satisfaction of a man who'd been proven right about suspicions he'd hoped were wrong. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news," Robert said, though his tone suggested he felt more vindicated than sorry. "But when Marcus Hendricks contacted me about recovering stolen money, I felt obligated to investigate. You can imagine my surprise when I learned that our mysterious Tessa Bloom is actually Tessa Bloom Hartwell, daughter of Daniel Bloom. The same Daniel Bloom who embezzled $50,000 from Colton 20 years ago." Tessa felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at the documents that laid out her life in clinical detail. Birth certificates, school records, employment history, all of it leading to the inescapable conclusion that she was exactly who Marcus claimed she was, the daughter of the man who'd helped destroy Colton's faith in human nature. It gets worse, Robert continued, extracting another set of papers from his briefcase. According to Mr. Hendricks, your father hid the stolen money before he died, and you're the only person who might know where it is. He believes you came here intentionally, hoping to seduce Colton into forgiving the debt or perhaps gain access to his finances to repay what your family owes. That's not true, Tessa whispered, but her voice lacked the conviction needed to counter such damning evidence. How could she explain that she'd come to the ranch seeking redemption for her father's sins, not to perpetuate them? How could she make anyone understand that her love for Colton was real, even though her presence there was based on deception? The sound of boots on the front porch announced Colton's return from his morning ride, and Tessa's heart clenched with the knowledge that everything was about to change forever. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had lain awake countless nights, imagining how the truth would finally surface, but she'd hoped to find the courage to tell him herself, on her own terms, when their love was strong enough to survive the revelation. Instead, she would watch him discover her deception through the cold presentation of legal documents and the accusations of people who'd never believed in her innocence. "Colton!" Robert called as footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Could you join us in the kitchen? There's something you need to see." Colton entered the room with the easy confidence of a man returning to a place where he felt safe and loved, but that confidence evaporated the moment he saw the expressions on their faces and the papers spread across the table. His pale eyes moved from Robert's grimly satisfied face to Tessa's stricken one, reading the story before anyone spoke a word. "What's this about?" he asked quietly, but Tessa could already see the walls beginning to rebuild themselves behind. His eyes, Robert handed him the file with the efficiency of a man delivering a business report rather than destroying someone's life. "This is about the woman you've been planning to marry, her real identity, her family history, and the reason she showed up at your ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back." Colton read in silence, his face growing more remote with each page. When he reached the photographs, school pictures of young Tessa standing beside her father at various family gatherings, Daniel Bloom's mugshot from his arrest, newspaper clippings about the embezzlement case, his hands began to shake, almost imperceptibly. "Sarah's maiden name was Bloom," he said finally, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man watching his worst nightmare repeat itself. "She was your sister." "Half-sister," Tessa corrected desperately, as if the distinction mattered now. "I barely knew her. I was only 14 when she left home, and I hadn't seen her since she was 18. I didn't even know about you until after she died, and Marcus started looking for the missing money. But you knew," Colton said, setting the papers down with careful precision. "When you showed up here asking for work, you knew exactly who I was and what your family had done to me." "Yes," she whispered, because there was no point in lying anymore. "I knew." The admission hung in the air between them like a death sentence. 20 years of careful emotional reconstruction crumbled in an instant, replaced by the familiar ache of betrayal that Colton had thought he'd finally healed from. The woman he'd learned to love, the future he'd allowed himself to imagine, the trust he'd slowly rebuilt, all of it was founded on deception, as complete as the one that had destroyed him before. "Get out," he said quietly. "Colton, please. Let me explain." "Get out!" The words exploded from him with 20 years of accumulated pain and rage. "Pack your things and get off my property, now." Tessa looked at him through tears that made everything blur together. The man she loved, the documents that condemned her, the kitchen where they'd shared so many quiet mornings that now felt like lies. She wanted to fight for him, to make him understand that her love was real, even if her arrival had been calculated. But the finality in his voice told her that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. She left without another word. carrying nothing but the small carved horse he'd made for her and the knowledge that she'd lost the only home she'd ever truly wanted. The engagement ring sat in its velvet box on Colton's kitchen table, the diamond catching the harsh fluorescent light like a mocking reminder of dreams that had proven to be as fragile as desert mirages. He'd planned to propose that very evening, had even rehearsed the words he wanted to say about building a future together, about trusting in love despite the scars of the past. Now the ring felt like evidence of his own foolishness, proof that some men were destined to make the same mistakes regardless of how much pain those mistakes had caused before. The confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its aftermath stretched through the long night like an echo that wouldn't fade. Colton sat in the kitchen, where Tessa had transformed cold functionality into warmth, where her laughter had filled spaces that had been silent for 20 years, and felt the familiar weight of betrayal settle over him like a shroud he'd thought he'd finally shed. The worst part wasn't the deception itself, though that cut deep enough. The worst part was how completely he'd believed in her, how thoroughly she'd managed to slip past every defense he'd spent 2 decades building. She'd played the role of the grateful employee, the vulnerable woman seeking only honest work, the loving partner who saw past his flaws to the man he might still become. And he'd believed every moment of it, had allowed himself to hope that maybe this time would be different. But blood told, as his grandfather used to say. Sarah Bloom had been charming and seemingly devoted right up until the moment she'd disappeared with his money and his business partner. Her half-sister had simply refined the technique, trading obvious gold-digging for a more subtle approach that targeted his emotions instead of just his bank account. "Mr. Wade?" Miguel's voice from the doorway interrupted his bitter reflections. The foreman stood uncertainly in the entrance, clearly aware that something catastrophic had occurred, but unsure how to address it. "The men are asking about Miss Tessa. Her truck's gone, and her room in the bunkhouse is cleaned out." "She won't be coming back," Colton said flatly, closing the ring box with a decisive snap. "Inform the crew that we're returning to previous staffing levels immediately." Miguel's weathered face showed his confusion and concern. In the months since Tessa's arrival, the entire atmosphere of the ranch had changed for the better. The men worked with more enthusiasm, shared meals instead of eating in isolation, and had begun to feel like a community rather than just employees. Her departure would leave a void that went far beyond the loss of an extra pair of hands. Did something happen? Is she all right? "She's exactly where she belongs," Colton replied, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "And this ranch will be exactly what it was before she arrived, efficient, profitable, and free of complications." But even as he spoke, Colton knew that returning to his previous existence would be impossible. Tessa had changed more than just the ranch's daily routines. She'd reminded him what it felt like to be fully alive, to wake up each morning with anticipation instead of resignation. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt suffocating. The solitude he'd treasured for 20 years now seemed like a prison of his own making. The kitchen felt enormous without her presence, the breakfast table too large for one person, the morning coffee bitter in ways that had nothing to do with how it was prepared. Even the horses seemed to sense her absence, looking toward the barn entrance with expectant eyes that slowly dimmed as the days passed without her familiar voice humming old songs while she worked. Robert Caldwell stopped by 3 days later, ostensibly to check on Colton's well-being, but clearly satisfied that his intervention had prevented what he saw as a disaster in the making. "I know this is difficult," he said, settling into the chair where Tessa used to sit during their morning conversations. "But you'll see in time that this was for the best. Better to learn the truth now than after you'd married her and given her legal access to everything you've built." "She never asked for anything," Colton found himself saying, though he immediately regretted defending the woman who deceived him so completely. They never do, not directly. That's what makes them so dangerous. Robert's tone carried the conviction of a man who'd seen too many wealthy friends taken advantage of by women with hidden agendas. "You were lucky this time, Colton. Lucky that someone cared enough to investigate before it was too late." But as Robert left and Colton returned to the empty house that had once felt like home, he wondered if what he felt could really be called luck. The woman who'd brought music back into his life was gone, taking with her the possibility that love might be stronger than the fear that had governed his choices for so long. The ring in its velvet box had been returned to the drawer where his mother's wedding band waited for a bride who might never come, and the future stretched ahead of him like an endless repetition of careful, sterile days. He'd been right to trust. No one, he told himself. Right to build walls that kept out both pain and joy. Right to choose safety over the risk of being hurt again. But if he was so right about everything, why did victory feel so much like defeat? The half-finished letter had been started and abandoned 7 times, each attempt growing more desperate and less coherent than the last. Tessa sat in the cramped motel room she'd rented with her last $40, staring at pages covered with crossed-out sentences and tear stains that had smudged her careful handwriting into illegible smears. How do you apologize for a deception that was born from the best intentions but had caused the worst possible outcome? How do you explain that love can grow from lies without sounding like every other person who'd ever tried to justify the unjustifiable? "Dear Colton," she'd written and rewritten, "I know you never want to see me again, and I understand why. But I need you to know that everything I felt for you was real, even if the reason I came to your ranch wasn't entirely honest. Each draft felt more inadequate than the last. Words seemed insufficient to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, too small to carry the weight of all the things she needed him to understand. That she'd arrived at his ranch seeking redemption, not exploitation. That her father's sins had haunted her entire adult life, driving her from job to job and town to town as she tried to outrun a guilt that wasn't entirely her own. That loving him had been the first pure thing in her life, unmarked by the stain of her family's failures. But every letter ended up in the wastebasket beside the bed, because what was the point of explanations when the fundamental truth remained? Unchanged, she had deceived him. She had known exactly who he was and what her family had done to him, and she'd chosen to keep that knowledge hidden while accepting his trust and his love. The town of Clearwater felt different now that she was no longer protected by Colton's employment and growing affection. The same people who'd whispered about her motives when she was with him now felt free to express their suspicions openly. At the diner where she'd tried to find work, the manager had looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain before informing her that they didn't need help from her kind. The gas station attendant had overcharged her for fuel while making pointed comments about people who came to town looking for easy money. Only Maria Santos, the elderly woman who owned the small motel, had shown her any kindness. Maria had lived long enough to understand that life was complicated, that good people sometimes made bad choices, and that everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were willing to work for it. "You look like someone carrying a heavy load," Maria observed one evening as Tessa sat on the narrow porch outside her room, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson. "Want to talk about it?" "I fell in love with someone I had no right to love," Tessa said simply, "and I lost him because of choices my family made before I was old enough to understand what choice meant." "Love's never about rights," Maria replied, settling into the plastic chair beside her. "It's about courage. The courage to open your heart despite the risk, and the courage to fight for what matters when everything seems hopeless." Meanwhile, at Wade Ranch, Colton was discovering that isolation wasn't the comfort he'd remembered it to be. The house felt haunted by Tessa's absence. Every room held memories of her presence. Every silence echoed with the ghost of her laughter. He'd had Miguel remove the wildflowers she'd planted in the kitchen garden, but their absence only made the space look more barren than before. The kitchen table where they'd shared so many quiet conversations now served only as a place to eat solitary meals that tasted like dust. The ranch hands moved through their duties with the mechanical efficiency he'd once prized, but the easy camaraderie that had developed during Tessa's time there had vanished. Breakfast was consumed in silence. Work was performed without the casual conversation that had made even difficult tasks feel manageable. And evenings found the men retreating to their individual quarters instead of gathering to share stories and companionship. Miguel made several attempts to broach the subject of what had happened, clearly concerned about both his employer's well-being and the impact on ranch morale. But Colton's responses were so firmly discouraging that the foreman eventually gave up, though his worried glances suggested he hadn't given up his concern. The worst moments came in the early morning hours when Colton would wake from dreams where Tessa was still there, still humming while she prepared breakfast, still looking at him with eyes that held love instead of guilt. The transition from dream to reality was brutal, a daily reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he'd chosen to give up. Robert Caldwell's occasional visits, meant to provide support and reinforcement for his decision, only made things worse. Robert's satisfaction with the outcome, his repeated assurances that Colton had dodged a bullet, felt increasingly hollow as the days passed without the relief that vindication was supposed to bring. Both of them were learning that being right wasn't the same as being happy, and that protecting yourself from further hurt sometimes meant protecting yourself from any possibility of healing as well. The yellowed envelope arrived at Maria's motel on a Tuesday morning, forwarded from 3 previous addresses as Tessa's. Father's effects finally caught up with her 2 years after his death. Inside, written in Daniel Bloom's familiar handwriting, was a confession that would change everything Colton thought he knew about the betrayal that had shaped 20 years of his life. Maria knocked gently on Tessa's door, holding the letter with the careful reverence of someone who recognized that some pieces of mail carried the weight of destiny. "This came for you, Misha. Looks important." Tessa had been packing her few belongings, preparing to leave Clearwater and find work in another town where her name didn't carry the burden of other people's sins. The sight of her father's handwriting stopped her cold, and she sank onto the narrow bed with trembling hands as she read words that had been meant for her eyes years earlier. "My dearest Tessa," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with the consequences of choices I made when I was too proud and too scared to ask for help when I needed it most." The confession that followed was detailed and devastating. Daniel Bloom hadn't embezzled money from Colton Wade. He'd borrowed it, with Colton's knowledge and blessing, to cover medical expenses when Tessa's mother was dying of cancer. The $50,000 had been a loan between friends, documented only by a handshake and the kind of trust that existed between men who'd grown up together in small-town Arizona. But when Sarah had decided to run away with Colton's business, or partner, she'd taken the loan documents from Daniel's files and destroyed them, making it appear that the money had been stolen rather than borrowed. She'd needed a way to explain her sudden departure and vast improvement in lifestyle, and framing her own father for embezzlement had served her purposes perfectly. "I tried to tell Colton the truth," Daniel had written. "Went to his ranch 3 times in the weeks after Sarah left, but he wouldn't see me. By then, she'd already told him I'd stolen the money, and with the documents gone, I had no way to prove otherwise. I was going to pay him back as soon as I could, but losing your mother. And then my reputation destroyed my business. I died owing money to a man who thought I'd betrayed him, and I've left you to carry the burden of a crime I never committed." The letter went on to explain how the guilt and shame had driven Daniel to drink, how he'd lost job after job as the story of his supposed embezzlement followed him from town to town, and how he'd finally died alone and broken, never able to clear his name or restore the friendship he'd valued more than his own life. "The money Marcus Hendricks is looking for doesn't exist," the letter concluded. I spent every penny on your mother's medical care, just as Colton intended when he offered to help. Sarah took everything else when she ran, not just Colton's trust, but the documents that would have proven my innocence. I should have fought. Harder to clear my name, but after your mother died, I didn't have the strength to fight anyone about anything. Tessa read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Her father hadn't been a criminal. He'd been a victim of Sarah's manipulation, just as Colton had been. The shame that had driven her from job to job, the guilt that had made her feel she owed some debt to Colton Wade, the secret that had ultimately destroyed her chance at happiness. All of it had been based on a lie that Sarah had constructed to cover her own crimes. "I have to show this to Colton," she whispered to Maria, who'd waited patiently while Tessa absorbed the contents of her father's final message. "Sigh, you do," Maria agreed. "But the question is whether he'll believe it, or whether 20 years of hurt has made him too suspicious to accept the truth even when it's right in front of him." Tessa folded the letter carefully and placed it in the envelope with her father's other effects. A few photographs, his worn wedding ring, and a small notebook where he'd kept track of every penny he'd hoped to someday repay to the friend who'd tried to help him save his wife's life. The evidence of his integrity was all there, preserved in his careful handwriting, waiting for someone to finally tell the true story of what had happened 20 years ago. The drive to Wade Ranch felt like traveling through 20 years of accumulated misunderstanding, each mile bringing her closer to a confrontation that could either restore both her father's reputation and her own chance at love, or finally close the door on any possibility of redemption. But for the first time since she'd fled the ranch in shame and heartbreak, Tessa felt the stirring of something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope that the truth might finally be enough to set them all free. As she turned down the familiar driveway toward the house where she'd been happier than she'd ever imagined possible, she clutched her father's letter like a lifeline and prayed that love might prove stronger than the lies that had kept them apart. The bus ticket to Phoenix sat in Tessa's back pocket like a one-way passage to nowhere, purchased with her last $20 in a moment of despair when Colton had refused to see her. She'd driven to Wade Ranch that morning with her father's letter clutched in her hands and hope burning in her chest, only to have Miguel deliver Colton's message from behind the firmly closed front door. "Mr. Wade says he has nothing to say to you and he'd prefer if you didn't come back." The words had hit her like a physical blow. But she'd tried again, leaving the letter with Miguel and asking him to at least read it, to understand that everything they'd believed about her father was wrong. But an hour later, Miguel had returned. The unopened envelope with another message. "Mr. Wade says the past is the past, and he's not interested in relitigating old business." So she'd bought the bus ticket and spent the afternoon sitting on a bench in Clearwater's small depot, watching the desert wind blow dust devils across the parking lot while she waited for the evening bus that would take her away from Arizona. Forever. The weight of failure pressed down on her shoulders like the desert heat. Failure to clear her father's name, failure to save the only love she'd ever known, failure to find the courage to fight for what mattered most. Miguel found her there as the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, his weathered face creased with concern and something that might have been anger. He settled beside her on the bench without invitation, studying the bus ticket in her hands with disapproval. "You're giving up too easy," he said finally, his accented English carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "He won't even read the letter," Tessa replied, holding up the envelope that contained her father's confession. 20 years of believing the worst about my family, and he's not willing to consider that he might have been wrong." "Mr. Wade's been hurt bad," Miguel acknowledged. "But hurt men sometimes need to be shaken awake before they can see past their own pain. That letter in your hands, it might change everything if he actually reads it. He's made his choice, has he? Or has he just gotten so comfortable with his pain that he's afraid to let it go?" Miguel stood and extended his hand to her. "Come with me." There's something you need to understand about stubborn men and the women who love them. Against her better judgment, Tessa found herself following Miguel back to his truck, the bus ticket still clutched in her free hand. He drove not toward Wade Ranch, but toward the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, where weathered headstones mark the final resting places of 3 generations of desert families. Mr. Wade comes here every year on the anniversary of his grandmother's death, Miguel said, parking near a section of the cemetery shaded by ancient cottonwoods. Talks to her like she's still listening, tells her about the ranch, about his troubles. Sometimes I think she's the only person he really trusts anymore. He pointed toward a marble headstone that read, Eleanor Wade, beloved wife, mother and grandmother, in elegant script. If you want him to listen, really listen. That's where you'll find him tomorrow evening. She's the one who taught him about love in the first place. Maybe she can help him remember. Tessa stared at the grave marker, understanding immediately what Miguel was suggesting. You want me to ambush him at his grandmother's grave. I want you to fight for what matters, Miguel corrected gently. That man has been half alive for 20 years, going through the motions of living, but never really living. You brought him back to life, Mija. Don't let fear drive you away when he needs you most. As they drove back toward town, Tessa felt something shift inside her chest, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her chin, a recognition that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. She'd spent her entire adult life running from her father's supposed sins, accepting blame that wasn't hers to carry, allowing other people's assumptions to define her worth. But the letter in her hands contained the truth, and the truth deserved to be heard regardless of how painful it might be to speak or to hear. Tomorrow evening, she would go to Eleanor Wade's grave and wait for a stubborn man to come seeking counsel from the woman who taught him that love was worth any risk. The bus to Phoenix left without her that night, carrying away her last chance at escape and leaving her to face the most important conversation of her life. As she watched its taillights disappear into the desert darkness, Tessa whispered a prayer to whatever guardian angels might be listening, that tomorrow would bring the courage she needed to fight for a love that had transformed them both. 2 matching silver rings lay side by side in Tessa's palm, simple bands that caught the last light of the desert sunset like promises waiting to be made. She'd purchased them that afternoon at the small jewelry store in town, using money Maria had lent her when she'd explained her plan. They weren't expensive, her resources wouldn't allow for anything elaborate, but they carried the weight of commitment and the hope that sometimes the most meaningful gestures were the simplest ones. Colton found her sitting beside his grandmother's grave, as Miguel had predicted, her dark hair stirring in the evening breeze that carried the scent of desert sage and the distant promise of rain. Eleanor Wade's headstone rose between them like a silent mediator, and for a moment he considered turning around and leaving before she noticed his presence. But something about the way she sat so quietly, so patiently, reminded him of his grandmother's own steadfast faith in the power of truth to eventually surface, no matter how deeply it had been buried. Miguel said you'd be here, he said finally, settling onto the stone bench his grandfather had placed beside the grave 60 years ago. I was hoping you'd come. Tessa's voice carried none of the desperation he'd expected, only a quiet determination that reminded him of the woman who'd convinced him to give her work despite his better judgment. I have something that belongs to you. Something I should have given you weeks ago. She handed him the envelope containing her father's letter without preamble, without explanation or justification. This won't change what I did, she said simply. Won't excuse the fact that I deceived you about who I was and why I came to your ranch, but it might change how you remember my father. Colton held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, and Tessa watched his face as he read the words that had waited 20 years to find their intended audience. She saw the moment comprehension dawned, the way his jaw tightened with something that might have been grief or rage or relief. When he finished reading, He sat in silence for so long that the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Above them, he tried to see me, Colton said finally. After Sarah left, Miguel told me someone had been coming to the ranch asking for me, but I wouldn't see anyone. I thought... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that revealed how completely Sarah's lies had poisoned his ability to trust. He never stopped trying to figure out how to pay you back, Tessa said softly. Even when he was dying, he was still keeping track of every penny, calculating interest, hoping somehow he'd find a way to clear his debt. There was no debt. The words came out rough with 20 years of accumulated guilt. I gave him that money freely, gladly. When his wife was sick, when you were just a girl who needed her mother, I would have given him twice that much if he'd asked. He knew that. It's why losing your friendship hurt him more than losing his reputation. Tessa pulled the small notebook from her pocket, filled with her father's careful calculations and desperate plans for repayment. He died believing you hated him for something he never did. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees and the distant call of a coyote greeting the emerging stars. When Colton finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of misdirected anger and the beginning of understanding. "I'm sorry," he said, the words emerging like a prayer, "not just for what happened to your father, but for what I put you through. For refusing to listen, for choosing to believe the worst instead of giving you a chance to explain. We both made choices based on fear," Tessa replied, opening her palm to reveal the 2 silver rings. "But maybe we could make different choices now, better choices." She explained her idea as the darkness deepened around them. Not an engagement, not yet, but a commitment to rebuild what they'd lost on a foundation of complete honesty. Promise rings that would represent their willingness to trust again, to fight for each other instead of against their own fears. "It won't be easy," she said as he examined the simple bands. "Learning to trust each other again, dealing with the gossip, working through 20 years of hurt and misunderstanding. But I love you, Colton Wade. I love the man who gave my father money to save my mother's life, and I love the man who taught me that home isn't a place, but a person you choose to build a life with." He slipped one of the rings onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, then allowed her to do the same for him. The bands caught the starlight like captured hope, and when he kissed her there, beside his grandmother's grave, it felt like a benediction from the woman who taught him that love was always worth the risk. "We'll take it slow," he promised against her lips. "Build it right this time, with no secrets between us." "No secrets," she agreed, and for the first time in weeks, the future stretched ahead of them like a road leading home, instead of a path to nowhere. The deed to Wade Ranch lay open. On the kitchen table, its official language now amended to include 2 names, where there had once been one. Colton Wade and Tessa Bloom Wade, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, the legal terminology that transformed a lifetime of solitary ownership into a true partnership built on trust, love, and the hard-won wisdom that some things were worth more than the safety of independence. 6 months had passed since their wedding day, when the entire community of Clearwater had gathered under the cottonwood trees beside the creek to witness a love story that had survived deception, betrayal, and the weight of 20 years' worth of accumulated hurt. The ceremony had been simple but profound, officiated by the same minister who'd buried Colton's grandparents and blessed by the presence of people who'd learned that sometimes the most unlikely romances produced the strongest marriages. Miguel had served as best man, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he watched his stubborn boss finally claim the happiness he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. Maria Santos had stood as Tessa's matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she witnessed the triumph of courage over fear, love over suspicion. Even Robert Caldwell had attended, offering his grudging approval and a wedding gift that included a written apology for his role in nearly destroying their relationship. The ranch house itself bore witness to the changes that love had wrought. The kitchen, where Tessa had first brought warmth and community, now hosted regular Sunday dinners for the ranch hands and their families, filling the space with the laughter and conversation that Colton's grandparents had once enjoyed. The living room that had stood empty for decades now held comfortable furniture arranged for actual use, books that were read rather than merely displayed, and photographs that captured moments of genuine happiness rather than formal poses. "Hard to believe it's been half a year," Colton said, settling into the chair across from his wife with the morning coffee that had become their daily ritual. The simple word, wife, still caused a flutter of amazement in his chest, as if he couldn't quite believe that such happiness was allowed after so many years of careful solitude. "Feels like a lifetime and a moment at the same time," Tessa replied, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on the slight swell of her abdomen where their first child was making its presence known. The pregnancy had been a surprise, discovered just 2 weeks after their wedding, but it felt like the natural progression of a love that had always been about building something larger than themselves. The baby would arrive in the spring, when the desert came alive with wildflowers and the promise of renewal that followed every harsh winter. They'd already begun preparing the nursery in the room that had once been Colton's childhood bedroom, painting walls that would soon echo with sounds the house had waited decades to hear. The legal resolution of the old embezzlement case had taken months, but Marcus Hendricks had eventually been forced to acknowledge that no crime had been committed and no debt existed. Daniel Bloom's reputation had been posthumously cleared, his name finally removed from the list of criminals who'd betrayed their friends for money. A small marker had been placed beside his grave, acknowledging him as a devoted husband and father, who died with his integrity intact, if not his reputation. "The baby should know about your father," Colton had said when they'd visited the cemetery together. "Should understand that he was a good man who made an honorable choice in impossible circumstances." Now, as they sat in the kitchen where their love had first taken root, Tessa found herself thinking about the stories they would tell their child, not just about Daniel Bloom's integrity, but about the importance of truth, the power of forgiveness, and the way love could bloom in the most unlikely places if people were brave enough to tend it properly. "What are you thinking about?" Colton asked, recognizing the thoughtful expression that usually preceded her most profound observations. "Legacy," she replied, gesturing toward the deed that made their partnership official and the home they were building together. "Your grandparents started this ranch with nothing but love and determination. My father tried to build something good despite circumstances that worked against him. We're just the next chapter in that story." "The next chapter," Colton agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand, "but maybe the one where it all comes together the way it was meant to." Outside, the desert stretched toward the horizon in all its harsh beauty, but inside the ranch house that had once been a fortress of solitude, there was warmth and laughter and the sound of two people planning a future that included more than just survival. The old transistor radio played softly in the background, filling the space with music that spoke of enduring love and second chances. And somewhere in the distance, thunder nickered a greeting to the morning that sounded remarkably like contentment. They had learned, both of them, that the best things in life often came disguised as complications, that trust was something to be built rather than simply given, and that love was not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to grow perfect together. The deed on the table was just paper and ink, but it represented something far more valuable, the choice to build a life based on partnership rather than protection, hope rather than fear. As the sun climbed higher over the mesas that had witnessed 3 generations of Wade dreams, Colton and Tessa Wade began planning another day in a life that had finally become everything they'd never dared to dream it could be.